Before this story continues, please allow me to make one important thing clear. The story you are about to hear is a work of fiction created for educational and entertainment purposes, exploring toxic family conflict and its emotional impact within the lives of U.S. military members and military families. All characters' ranks, units, events, and situations are entirely fictional and do not represent, reflect, or imply any real individuals, units, or organizations within the U.S. Army, Navy, Air Force, Marine Corps, or Coast Guard. This content may be supported by AI tools during the creative and production process. This story does not describe real events, does not disclose military information, and does not promote violence, hatred, or harm of any kind. The message is told with respect for the core values of the United States military, including honor, discipline, responsibility, and human dignity. The entire narrative is built to be advertiser-friendly and compliant with YouTube community guidelines and is not intended to distort or misrepresent the image of the U.S. military or its service members. If you are a woman who has ever stood behind a military family who has stayed quiet, endured more than others could see, please stay until the end, and if this story reaches you, share your thoughts in the comments or follow the channel to continue with stories for strong hearts that are rarely heard. My name is Mira. I am 25 years old, and at the time this happened, it was October 2024. I serve in the Air Force on an aviation track, a role that taught me early how to listen more than I speak and how to hold myself steady when the room tilts. I do not talk about my work at family gatherings, not because I am ashamed, but because I was taught that competence does not announce itself. My stepfather, Richard Hale, is 56. He loves patriotic language and the appearance of authority, but he has never respected the people who actually serve my mother. Elaine is 52, and she believes peace means silence, even when silence costs someone their dignity. My stepbrother Evan is 27, the golden child, the one whose jokes land because no one ever asks who they hurt. We were flying from Dallas-Fort Worth to Phoenix for a family event, an anniversary dinner that my mother begged me to attend, saying, "Please do not make this a thing. We just need to show up, smile, and get through one night." I agreed, because that is what I have always done. I show up. I keep my head down. I carry what needs to be carried. At the gate, Richard insisted we change seats. He said it would be easier for Elaine to sit near him, and he waved his boarding pass like a small badge of control. I did not argue, and found myself wedged between strangers while my mother was placed rows away. The cabin was already full when Richard spoke loudly enough for half the aisle to hear. "She is not really military. She just wears the uniform." A few people glanced over. Someone smiled awkwardly. I felt heat rise in my neck, but I kept my eyes forward. Evan laughed, and I saw him tilt his phone just enough to record before sliding it back into his pocket. I knew where that video would go. A flight attendant paused near my row and asked casually what unit I served with, and before I could answer, Richard leaned in and said, "She cannot say because there is nothing to say." It landed hard, not just the words, but the way he enjoyed them, the way my mother stayed quiet, the way the cabin absorbed it and moved on. I stood there for a second too long, feeling the familiar pull to correct the record and the stronger instinct to let the moment pass. Because in my line of work, you learn that timing is everything. I sat down, I breathed, I swallowed the ache and watched the aisle fill and clear. I told myself it was just another dinner table, another small cruelty that would fade. But as we pushed back from the gate, something in me tightened, not from what was said, but from what was taken. That moment did not just insult me. It denied my personhood in front of people who would never know the truth. And then the plane lifted and the noise changed. Not dramatically, not enough to alarm, but enough that I noticed. And when you are trained to notice small things, you do not dismiss them. The seatbelt sign chimed off and on, and Richard leaned across the aisle to whisper something about how even the plane seemed tired of my stories. I did not respond. I watched the flight attendants' faces. I watched their hands. I watched how often they checked the interphone. I felt the old pressure cooker begin to hiss, the kind that builds when you are told to be small, while everything in you is trained to stand ready. I thought about my mother and the way she asked me to keep the peace. And I thought about the lesson drilled into me from my first briefing that when someone tries to humiliate you in public, they are asking the system to prove them wrong. I did not know then how literal that lesson would become, but I knew enough to stay quiet to listen and to wait if you have ever been dismissed for serving stay to the end, because what happened next is why I did not say a single word back. The memory of Richard Hale did not begin on that plane. It had been building for years, quietly, predictably, the way pressure builds behind a closed valve. From 2018 through 2024, he learned how to use money and social standing as tools not to provide but to control. He never shouted, he never needed to. His power lived in invitations withheld, conversations redirected, and decisions made just before I arrived, so I could be told afterward that it was already handled. Every gathering followed the same pattern. He would clap his hands together, smile at the table, and say, "Let's keep this light," before turning to me with a half grin and asking if I was still in that phase. The word phase landed often. It was his favorite way to shrink what I did to something temporary, childish, and easily dismissed. When I answered calmly, he would interrupt and explain for me, saying it was more of a government hobby than a career, and the table would move on. My stepbrother Evan would smirk, and my mother Elaine would look down at her plate and ask if anyone needed more water. That was escalation 1, the steady erosion of voice. The second escalation came when silence was not enough and threat was required. It happened during a holiday dinner in late 2022 when Richard leaned back in his chair and said quietly, so only I could hear, that if I embarrassed the family by correcting him again, I would not be invited next time. Elaine heard the tone and jumped in immediately, saying, "Mira, please do not make this a thing, you know how he is." Her words were meant to calm, but they cut deeper because they framed the problem as my response, not his behavior. That night, I learned that peace in that house meant surrender. The third escalation was always public or close enough to it to sting. At restaurants, at fundraisers, and eventually at airport gates. Richard loved to narrate the family story to anyone who would listen. He would gesture toward Evan and say, "My son is the real achiever," while nodding toward me with a dismissive smile, and adding "just enlisted," as if those two words explained everything. In October 2024, at the gate in Dallas-Fort Worth, he did it again, telling a couple near us that his daughter had chosen a practical path while I was still finding myself. The words were light, but the message was sharp, and it was meant to be overheard. I stood there holding my boarding pass, feeling the familiar heat in my chest, and choosing again not to speak, because in my work, timing matters, and this was not yet the moment. What hurt most was not the mockery, but the consistency. The way Richard repeated these lines until they sounded like facts, the way Elaine smoothed the air afterward, asking me to let it go, the way Evan recorded pieces of it like trophies. That is how favoritism works. It does not explode, it accumulates. And then there was the sentence that still echoes in my head, the one that landed harder than all the others. It came after Richard had laughed about my uniform and said to someone nearby that my service was a costume. The word costume stripped away everything I had trained for, everything I had earned, and reduced it to a prop. He said it easily because he believed it. He believed my work was something I put on and took off while his authority was permanent. I did not argue. I did not correct him. I watched my mother avert her eyes and felt something settle inside me. Not anger, not fear, but clarity. The pressure cooker tightened, and I knew I would carry it quietly as I always had. As we waited to board, my phone buzzed once. A short message, no greeting, no explanation. Check-in complete. Follow the protocol. I did not reply. I never do when the instruction is clear. I locked the screen and slipped the phone back into my pocket, aware of the small difference between my schedule and theirs. The way some things in my life do not require explanation because they are not meant to be shared. Richard kept talking, filling the space with stories that made him sound important and generous, and I kept listening, watching. The flow of people through the gate. The way staff moved with purpose. The way my own breath stayed steady. I knew then what I always know. That quiet respect does not announce itself. It waits, it observes, and it moves only when it must. If you know what that kind of respect looks like, drop a. I did not join the military to escape anything, and I never said that out loud, because people who look for drama tend to hear it that way. I joined because I needed order. I needed a place where expectations were written down, where responsibility was clear, and where showing up mattered more than being liked. In my early 20s, I learned quickly that discipline is not loud. It is repetitive. It is showing up on time every time, even when no one is watching. I learned to read a room before I spoke to, listen for what was not being said, and to keep my voice level when pressure tried to pull it higher. Those lessons carried me through training and through the quiet routines that never make headlines. Daily life was not cinematic. It was schedules, inspections, checklists, and paperwork that had to be right because people depended on it. There were mornings that started before sunrise and ended with forms signed and re-signed because details matter. There were drills that tested patience more than strength and evaluations that asked the same questions again and again until your answers stopped changing under stress. In that environment, you learn to hold discomfort without reacting. You learn to take correction without defense and to accept responsibility without excuses. That is where I learned how to be still when insulted, because reacting rarely fixes the thing that needs fixing. The hardest part was not the work it was carrying, the weight of my mother's silence. Her quiet acceptance of Richard's words cut deeper than anything he said because it told me that keeping peace mattered more than protecting truth. I could endure mockery. I could absorb jokes and dismissive comments. But watching her look away taught me how loneliness can exist in a crowded room. I did not resent her. I understood her fear of conflict, but understanding did not erase the hurt. It simply taught me how to compartmentalize. In the military, you learn to separate feeling from function, not because feelings are unimportant, but because function keeps people safe. That mindset shaped everything I did. I learned to observe patterns, to notice when small changes signaled larger problems, and to act only when the moment demanded it. There was a briefing once that stayed with me more than any other. The room was quiet, and the instructor spoke without emphasis, saying, when safety is compromised, rank is irrelevant. Protocol is law. That sentence settled into me because it stripped away ego and left only responsibility. It reminded us that competence is measured by action, not title, and that in critical moments, clarity matters more than confidence. I had been trained around aviation safety principles and crew resource management ideas that prioritize communication, situational awareness, and decision-making under pressure. We practiced speaking up when something felt wrong, and just as importantly, we practiced listening when someone else did. That training never asked us to be heroes. It asked us to be reliable. It asked us to show up prepared and to support the system so the system could protect others. That is why I never bragged about what I did. Bragging invites comparison, and comparison distracts from purpose. I knew my schedule was different from my family's. I knew there were days when I could not explain where I was going or why, and that was not secrecy. It was necessity. Need to know is not about hiding, it is about focus. So when my phone buzzed at the gate with a short instruction, I treated it the way I treat all such messages. I acknowledged it internally and moved on. There was nothing to prove to anyone there. In that space between duty and family, I learned something essential about myself. I learned that my pain did not come from being underestimated by a man who valued appearances. It came from being unseen by the person who raised me. That realization did not weaken me. It clarified my priorities. It reminded me why I chose a path built on accountability rather than approval. In the military, you do not win arguments by speaking louder. You win trust by being ready when it counts. I carried that with me as the plane taxied and the cabin noise settled, because the work I had done was not for applause. It was for moments that require steadiness when everything else shakes. In the military, you do not argue with your mouth. You argue with your capability at the exact moment it matters most. Once we were airborne, the cabin settled into that familiar hum that most people mistake for calm. But a few minutes later, I felt a vibration that did not match the rhythm I expected. It was subtle, a shallow tremor through the seat and floor, followed by a sound that did not repeat evenly. the kind of noise you notice only if you have been trained to listen for it. I did not move. I did not reach for my bag. I only adjusted my breathing and watched. The seatbelt sign flicked on, then off again, and a few passengers glanced around before returning to their screens. Richard leaned across the aisle with a grin and said loudly, "See, even the plane is tired of her stories." Evan laughed a little too quickly, and I saw him glance at me as if waiting for a reaction. I gave him none. A flight attendant passed by, and I noticed the way her smile tightened at the edges before she turned toward the galley. There was another light vibration, then a pause longer than the first, and I felt my stomach drop not from fear, but from recognition. Richard raised his hand and waved the attendant back with the authority he liked to borrow and said, "Make sure she does not cause a scene, as if my presence alone was a disruption." The attendant nodded politely, but her eyes flicked to me and lingered for half a second longer than courtesy requires. That was escalation 1, public humiliation disguised as concern. I could feel the heat of it spread through the rows around us, the way attention sharpens when someone is singled out. I kept my hands folded and my gaze forward, counting the seconds between sounds. The second escalation came quieter and closer. Richard leaned in until his voice dropped and said, "If something happens, remember this: nobody will listen to you." The words were meant to paralyze, to remind me of my place in his story, where authority belongs to the loudest voice, not the most prepared. I felt the old reflex to withdraw to let the moment pass. But another vibration rolled through the cabin, stronger this time, and the reflex gave way to duty. I watched the crew more carefully than the micro cues I had been trained to notice. The way one attendant reached for the interphone and hesitated. The way another walked faster than necessary down the aisle. The way a third stopped smiling altogether. Cabin crew stopped smiling. That was the detail that confirmed my concern. Because people can hide nerves, but they cannot fake ease when procedures change. I noticed a checklist being pulled from a pocket and scanned quickly, then folded again, as if the timing was not right. Yet, I recognize the choreography of uncertainty when professionals wait for confirmation before acting. My mind ran through patterns, and I remembered a single term from training, a call sign we used to center communication when distractions pile up. I did not say it out loud, but it anchored me. I weighed the cost of speaking against the cost of staying silent. And for the first time since boarding, I felt the pressure cooker shift from personal pain to shared risk. I wanted to ignore Richard to protect my mother from another confrontation. But duty does not care about comfort. It cares about outcome. The plane shuddered again, and this time a few passengers gasped. Someone whispered a prayer. I saw a man clutch his armrest, and a child begin to cry softly. I met the eyes of the attendant nearest me, and saw a question there, not spoken, but present. I did not answer yet. I watched one more pass of the aisle, one more glance toward the cockpit door, one more exchange between crew that ended without a smile. I could read the checklist in her hands from the corner of my eye, and I knew enough to understand what it did not include. The threat, Richard had whispered, still rang in my ears. But it no longer held power because it was built on a lie that authority comes from volume. The truth is, authority comes from readiness, and readiness does not announce itself. I straightened in my seat and steadied my voice internally, preparing not to argue, but to assist if asked. I did not need to prove who I was. I only needed to be useful if the moment arrived. If you are still here, you already know this was not just family drama. The announcement came without drama, and that was what made it unsettling. The captain spoke calmly, thanked everyone for their patience, and mentioned a minor issue that required attention. He avoided specifics and promised an update soon, but his tone carried an edge that turbulence announcements do not carry. The plane jolted again, not sharply, but unevenly, and the overhead bins rattled in a way that did not match the air outside. The seatbelt sign stayed on longer than usual, and the cabin grew quiet in that collective way. People grow quiet when they sense something is wrong, but do not yet know what to fear. This turbulence felt different. Not the rolling waves of weather, but short, irregular shudders that interrupted one another. Passengers looked up from their screens, and a murmur spread, then faded as people waited for reassurance that did not come. Cabin crew moved through the aisle with deliberate speed, and I watched how they placed their feet, how they checked their watches, how one of them paused by the cockpit door and rested her hand there for a beat too long. Then the question came, not over the loudspeaker, but quietly from an attendant standing a few rows ahead of me, asking if anyone on board had aviation experience. The words were careful, chosen to invite help without causing panic. Richard burst out laughing before anyone else could respond, and said loudly, "My stepdaughter thinks she is a hero." Evan joined in, and a few people chuckled nervously, not because it was funny, but because humor is how people cope when fear creeps in. I felt eyes turn toward me, and I let them pass through without meeting them. The attendant hesitated, looking between us, weighing the risk of asking again. I could hear someone crying softly, a few rows back, and another passenger murmuring a prayer under his breath. The plane shuddered once more, and the attendant repeated the question, this time with more urgency. I stood up slowly, not to draw attention, but because the moment had arrived, I did not announce who I was. I did not list credentials. I said, only, I can assist. Tell me what you need. The simplicity of it cut through the noise. The attendant studied my face, searching for confidence or bravado, and finding neither only readiness. She nodded, but did not move immediately, because procedure matters and deviation carries risk. I gave her one sentence, the kind you learn to use when stress compresses time. I said, if you are seeing conflicting indications, assign one person to read one checklist out loud and keep the channel clear. It was not jargon, it was human factors, plain and practical. The effect was immediate. She exhaled once and motioned for another attendant to take her place with the passengers, then gestured for me to follow her toward the front. Richard called after us. Something about overreacting, but his voice sounded thin now, drowned out by the shifting weight of the plane. As we moved closer to the cockpit, I kept my hands visible and my steps measured, aware of the chain of command and the importance of not escalating without cause. The attendant spoke briefly into the interphone using a tone that signaled seriousness without alarm, and the door remained closed as it should. But another crew member met us in the narrow space nearby and asked what I could do. I answered the same way, short, clear, and without emotion. I can help you organize information and reduce workload. They exchanged a glance, and I saw the calculation finish in their eyes, competence over ego, protocol over pride. We stopped just short of the cockpit, and I listened as instructions were relayed inside. The plane lurched harder this time, and a few passengers cried out. Several people began to pray out loud, and someone gripped my arm as I passed. I did not pull away. I nodded once to acknowledge them and kept moving, because calm is contagious if you carry it steadily. The crew began repositioning passengers and securing the cabin, and I watched how their shoulders loosened as tasks became defined. I knew the tone to use. When speaking to authority, respectful, direct, and concise. The chain of command does not require silence, it requires clarity. I answered questions when asked and stayed quiet when not. The turbulence continued, uneven and unsettling, and the captain spoke again, this time instructing everyone to remain seated and reassuring them that we were working the issue. His voice was steady, but I could hear the concentration beneath it. The cabin lights flickered briefly, and a woman near the aisle began to sob openly. An older man clasped his hands and bowed his head. The fear in the cabin was no longer abstract. It was present and spreading, and through it all I felt strangely centered. Not fearless, but focused. The training that taught me to manage my voice and posture when stakes are high took over, and I held myself the way I had been taught to hold others steady, by being steady myself. The crew moved with purpose. Now, no wasted motion, no unnecessary words, and I stayed where I was useful, answering short questions and confirming information when needed. I did not touch controls. I did not give orders beyond my scope. I supported the system so it could function as designed. As the plane shuddered again, I caught Richard watching from his seat, his expression stripped of mockery and replaced by something closer to disbelief. The world he understood, where volume equals authority, had slipped away, and in its place was a quieter hierarchy built on preparation and trust. Passengers continued to cry and pray and grip armrests, but the crew worked, and I remained calm, because calm is not the absence of fear, it is the decision to act anyway. If you believe respect is earned in silence, do not blink here. I never asked to be in charge, and nobody offered it to me. The cockpit remained the cockpit, and the captain remained the captain. The door stayed shut except for brief controlled exchanges through the interphone, and the narrow space outside it became a pressure point where seconds mattered and words mattered even more. The lead attendant brought me into that space and said, "We need help keeping information clean." I understood what she meant right away. When stress rises, everyone talks at once, and the first thing that breaks is communication. People repeat themselves. People add guesses. People turn one problem into three because nobody can tell what is signal and what is noise. I said quietly, "Tell me what you know for sure and who is speaking to the cockpit." She pointed to a senior crew member holding the phone, and I said, "Keep it to one voice, one channel, one message at a time." Then I turned slightly and looked back into the cabin where fear was starting to boil over, and I felt the pull of 100 eyes wanting someone to promise them everything would be fine. I could not promise that, so I did what training taught me to do. I worked the process. I confirmed what could be confirmed. I asked the attendant for the sequence they were using, and she showed me a laminated card, and I said, "Good, stay with it. Do not skip steps because the cabin is loud." I watched her hands tremble, and I kept my voice flat and steady, and that steadiness gave her something to hold on to. The captain spoke again over the speaker, short controlled words telling everyone to remain seated and reminding the crew to secure the cabin. His tone was calm, but there was no small talk now, no jokes, no extra comfort lines, and that told me their workload had spiked. Inside the cabin, a woman began praying loudly, and another passenger pressed the call button repeatedly, as if the light could summon safety. Richard tried to rise from his seat, 2 rows back, to see what was happening, and a flight attendant put a hand up and told him to sit down. He bristled instantly, the old reflex of a man who expects compliance because he speaks with confidence. He said, "Do you know who I am?" And she did not answer him. She simply repeated, "Sit down, sir," and moved on. That was the first time I saw him realize the cabin did not belong to him. The plane jolted again, and the sound of metal and plastic creaking traveled through the floor like a warning. Evan stopped filming because even he could feel the shift from drama to danger. The lead attendant asked me what she should say to passengers who were panicking. I did not give a speech. I gave a structure. I said, keep it simple. Tell them what to do, not what to fear. Seatbelts, tight heads down if instructed. Breathing slow, stay out of the aisle. Then I asked her to assign roles. One person on cabin compliance, one person on medical readiness, one person on communication, and one person to watch for anyone who might try to rush forward. When she looked uncertain, I added quietly, "You are not creating new jobs, you are protecting the checklist from chaos." She nodded and began delegating, and I watched the cabin change as soon as people had purpose. Panic feeds on helplessness and starves when someone gives it a job. Even small jobs like checking seatbelts and collecting loose items can pull a person back from the edge. I kept my hands open and my posture non-threatening because I was not there to perform, I was there to support their system. The senior crew member at the interphone relayed a short question from the cockpit, asking if anyone on board had formal aviation training beyond hobby level. The way she said hobby level told me they had heard enough nonsense from the cabin already. I answered through her. Not directly, I said yes. I have operational aviation training, and I can assist with crew resource management and human factors support. I did not mention rank. I did not mention a unit. I did not make it about me. The cockpit asked one more question. What is your comfort level with emergency procedures? I answered honestly. I understand the process, and I can help you keep communication clean and tasks organized. There was a pause. Then the crew member listened and nodded as if someone inside had made a decision. The lead attendant looked at me and said, They want you to stay here and help us run the cabin interface. That was fine. That was exactly where I could be useful. I confirmed what information was coming from where I wrote down the sequence of updates, so nothing got lost, and I kept the crew from stacking problems on top of problems. When the captain called for a cabin check, I made sure it was done fast and clean, and reported once, not 5 times. When one attendant tried to add her own interpretation, I cut gently but firmly. I said, report observations, not conclusions. Keep it factual. The plane shuddered, and then leveled, and then shuddered again, like something trying to find its place and failing. The cabin grew hot with adrenaline, the smell of coffee and cologne mixed with the sharp scent of fear. Richard kept watching me, and I could feel his mind scrambling for a story that put him back on top. He leaned toward a man across the aisle and said loudly, "She thinks she knows what she is doing because she wears a uniform." The man did not respond. He kept his eyes forward and tightened his seatbelt, and that silence hit Richard harder than an argument because it denied him an audience. He tried again with a different passenger, saying, "My family is military too," and the passenger said, without looking up, "Not like that, sir," and went back to praying. That was when Richard's face changed from smug to unsettled, because he could not force respect out of strangers in a crisis. The lead attendant asked me to help reduce panic near the rear, where a few passengers were rising despite instructions. I walked halfway down the aisle with a crew member, and I did not scold anyone. I spoke low and direct. I said, "Sit down now. Keep your belt on. Breathe in through your nose 4 seconds out, or through your mouth 6 seconds. You are safer seated than standing." The cadence mattered, the certainty mattered. People obey when your voice does not ask permission. They sat. Then we returned forward and the lead attendant whispered, "You are good at this." And I said, "I was trained for it. Nothing more." Another jolt hit and the interphone crackled and the senior crew member listened, then looked at me with a strange expression, like recognition trying to form. She said softly, "You have done this before." I felt the weight of that sentence, because it was close to the truth without touching it. I answered the only honest way. "Not like this, but I understand the process." She nodded as if that was exactly what she needed to hear. The cockpit did not need a hero. It needed a crew that could think and communicate and execute under pressure, and the cabin needed someone who would not feed the fear with ego. I stayed in my lane and kept the lane clear. Richard watched all of it, and I saw fear take root behind his eyes. The fear of losing control not over the plane, but over the narrative he had been building for years. He had always owned the room by deciding what people believed about me, and now a room full of strangers was listening to me without asking his permission. And he could not stop it. He could not talk louder than the checklist. He could not intimidate the laws of physics. He could not buy authority in that narrow space outside the cockpit, where competence was the only currency that mattered. The descent began without celebration, and that restraint told me more than any announcement could. The captain spoke again, calm and precise, informing us we would be landing shortly in Phoenix and instructing everyone to remain seated and follow crew directions. The plane shuddered once more, then steadied, and the sound changed from uneven strain to controlled resistance, like a system finally finding a path. The cabin was quiet now, not the anxious quiet from before, but a focused stillness, as if everyone had collectively decided to listen. The crew moved down the aisle, checking belts and securing loose items, and I stayed in my place near the front, answering only what I was asked, and nothing more. When the wheels touched down, there was no cheering, just a long exhale that rippled through the rows. People cried openly now, not from fear but release, hands clasped and foreheads pressed to seat backs, and a few whispered thank you to no one in particular. The plane slowed and turned and came to a complete stop, and only then did the captain speak again, thanking everyone for their cooperation and adding one line that changed the room. He said, "We would like to acknowledge a passenger with aviation and military training who assisted our crew during the incident and helped ensure a safe landing." The words were simple, but they carried weight. Heads turned slowly toward me, as if pulled by a current. I felt the heat of attention settle on my shoulders, and I did not move. I kept my hands folded and my gaze level, because this moment was not about claiming credit. It was about truth, finding daylight. People stared not with curiosity now, but with recognition. The same faces that had absorbed Richard's comments earlier were looking at me differently, measuring what they had seen against what they had been told. Richard sat frozen, his mouth slightly open as if he were waiting for a laugh track that never came. Evan looked down at his phone, then slid it into his pocket without turning it on. My mother finally met my eyes across the aisle, and I saw something like understanding flicker there, mixed with regret. The crew began preparing for disembarkation, and as they did, the atmosphere shifted from crisis to consequence. A man in the row ahead leaned back and said quietly to Richard, "Sir, maybe do not talk about what you do not understand." It was not said with anger, just with certainty, and it landed harder than any insult, because it carried the authority of experience, not volume. Richard tried to respond, but no words came. The people around him did not argue, they did not engage, they simply turned away, and that withdrawal stripped him of the stage he depended on. When the door opened and the jet bridge connected, a uniformed airport authority figure stepped inside along with airline operations staff. Their presence was calm, professional, and unmistakable, and they spoke first to the crew, then scanned the cabin until their eyes found me. One of them approached, nodded once, and said, "Mom, we briefed." The word ma'am carried a different gravity than courtesy. It was recognition, and it was intentional. I acknowledged them with a nod and followed their direction to remain seated briefly, while they coordinated with the captain. Passengers watched this exchange unfold, and the silence grew heavier. Not uncomfortable, but instructive. It showed without explanation who had been trusted and who had not. Richard shifted in his seat, attempting to straighten his jacket and reclaim some semblance of control. But there was nothing left to control here. The system had already spoken, and it did not speak in his language. As passengers stood to retrieve bags, they looked at me, not with awe, but with gratitude and respect, the kind that does not need to be verbalized. A woman squeezed my arm as she passed and whispered, "Thank you." A man gave a small nod, the kind shared between people who understand responsibility. The crew thanked me quietly and returned to their duties, and I stepped aside so the flow could continue. Because this was never about being seen. It was about being effective. Richard remained seated longer than necessary, watching the aisle empty around him, and for the first time since I had known him, he had nothing to say. His power had always depended on shaping perception, and now perception had been reshaped by events he could not spin. He had tried to make me small in front of strangers, and now those same strangers had seen me serve without asking for anything in return. The public exposure was complete, not through accusation, but through contrast. The airport authority returned and indicated I could disembark. When I stood, the cabin paused for a fraction of a second, then resumed its movement as if acknowledging a fact and moving on. That pause was enough. It told the story Richard had been telling for years, had lost its hold right where he wanted it most, in front of people whose opinions he valued. He followed later, avoiding my eyes and avoiding everyone else's too, because silence had finally taken its place as the loudest voice in the room. The aftermath did not arrive with sirens or cameras. It arrived quietly through statements and glances and the subtle recalibration of stories people tell themselves to stay comfortable. The airline released a brief update later that day, confirming a precautionary diversion and thanking the crew for professionalism and a passenger with aviation and military training for assisting during the event. It was not a headline, it was a paragraph buried beneath weather and traffic. And that restraint mattered because it framed the incident as competence rather than spectacle. Local outlets repeated the wording almost exactly and moved on. The lack of drama felt appropriate and final, like a system closing a file and turning to the next task. Elaine sat beside me in the terminal longer than necessary, her hands folded and unfolded as if she were trying to decide which version of herself to be. She said she was proud, and then immediately worried about how Richard would take it, the two feelings colliding. Without resolution, I told her I was fine, And she nodded too quickly, relief and fear crossing her face in equal measure. She had spent years managing his moods, and now she was managing the consequences of not managing them sooner. Evan hovered nearby, unusually quiet, his phone face down on the armrest. I saw him swipe and tap and then swipe again a few minutes later, deleting the video he had taken earlier. He did it carefully, as if erasing evidence could erase intent. He did not look at me, but I had already seen enough. The act itself was confirmation that he understood what had shifted and that he wanted to outrun it. Richard tried first to reclaim the moment with humor, saying he had known all along that I would step up and that he had just been pushing me the way fathers do. He said he was testing me, as if that explained the public humiliation and the threats whispered in a narrow aisle. When that did not land, he pivoted, saying he had always believed in me and that his comments were misunderstood attempts at motivation. The rewrite was smooth, practiced, and familiar, and I let it play out without interruption, because watching someone narrate their own absolution can be revealing. He needed an audience and found none. The people around us were polite but distant, their attention already redirected to connections and baggage and the next obligation. Silence replaced argument, and in that silence, the new truth settled that the power to define me had moved beyond his reach. I did not correct him. I did not agree either. I observed the way his confidence rose and fell with each reaction he failed to get, and I recognized the pattern from years of dinners and fundraisers. Only now it lacked traction. Elaine listened with her eyes lowered, then looked at me and asked softly if I was okay. Not with what had happened on the plane, but with what was happening now. I told her I was steady, and that steadiness seemed to frighten her more than anger would have because it meant I did not need permission to stand where I stood. Later. When we separated for the night, my phone rang once from a number I recognized but did not save. A short voice on the other end said, "You handled it the right way," and then the call ended. No congratulations, no questions, just acknowledgement. The brevity told me everything I needed to know and nothing I could share. I pocketed the phone and returned to the terminal, feeling the strange quiet that follows when responsibility recedes and leaves reflection in its wake. Over the next day, the ripples continued small and personal. Friends of the family texted Elaine with vague praise and questions that avoided names. Richard answered some and ignored others, his tone shifting depending on who he thought was listening. He tried again with me over breakfast, saying, "Families should stick together and that appearances matter, and that we could turn this into something positive, if we were careful." I stirred my coffee and watched the surface settle and said nothing because there was nothing to add. The value of the moment was not in rebuttal, but in restraint. Watching him attempt to reclaim the narrative confirmed what I had learned in uniform, that the person who humiliated you will often rush to become your supporter. The instant recognition arrives. That pivot is not reconciliation, it is preservation. And preservation without accountability is just another costume. He sensed the distance and grew uneasy, pressing for reassurance that never came. The consequence was not loud or immediate. It was the gradual loss of influence that comes when people stop asking your opinion and start making their own choices. The system had moved and taken its recognition with it, and no amount of rewriting could bring it back. The request came sooner than I expected, and exactly the way it always had, quietly and framed as necessity rather than apology. Richard asked to meet under the pretense of clearing the air, choosing a public place where he believed decorum would protect him, and familiarity would soften me. He spoke first about schedules and weather, and then about rumors moving through his business circle, how people had questions, how a board member had asked whether recent events reflected a pattern. He said it lightly at first, as if this were a misunderstanding that could be smoothed over with the right phrasing. Then he leaned in and asked if I would be willing to confirm a few things in writing. Nothing complicated, just a statement that he could share to reassure partners that everything was fine and that the incident had been exaggerated. He asked before he apologized, which told me everything I needed to know. His concern was not harm done, but image threatened. He followed with an apology that arrived late and incomplete, saying he was sorry if his words had been taken the wrong way and that he had only wanted to motivate me. He said families support each other and that my credibility could help protect the family name. The pivot was fast and desperate, and for the first time I saw fear in him. Not fear of what he had done, but fear of what he was losing. I let him finish without interrupting, and then I answered with one sentence. You do not get to use my honor as your shield. The words landed clean and final without accusation or anger. He stared at me as if waiting for a second sentence that never came, and when none did, he began to bargain, promising to do better, to listen more, to be careful with his words. He spoke about appearances and loyalty, and the cost of letting things spiral. I listened long enough to be certain he understood my refusal. And then I stood and left, because prolonging the moment would have fed his need for control. The consequences unfolded quickly, and not at my hand. Partners, delayed meetings. Community invitations stopped arriving. Conversations that once included his opinion moved forward without it. The distance was subtle but unmistakable, like a door that closes softly and locks itself. Richard tried to present confidence, but it frayed at the edges, and I saw the strain in his posture and the way he checked his phone too often. Elaine called later, worried and confused, asking whether I could reconsider for the sake of peace, and I told her, peace built on denial does not hold. She was quiet, then said she understood, even if it scared her. The community response was not punitive, it was selective, and that selectivity was what unsettled him most. Respect had been conditional, and the condition had failed. He could not argue his way back into rooms that no longer asked him to speak. The fear he showed was not about losing me. It was about losing standing, and that distinction clarified everything. He had measured people by usefulness, and now usefulness had shifted away from him. The system that once amplified his voice had moved on, and he was left trying to catch up without leverage. The drama he expected never came. Instead, there was a slow, steady withdrawal of trust that no speech could reverse. If someone only respects you when it benefits them, call it what it is. The consequences did not arrive with shouting or revenge speeches. They arrived the way real life corrects people, quietly and in public. Richard lost what he worshipped most. Not money, not a house, not a title, but the warm, automatic deference he had trained himself to expect. The phone calls from certain friends slowed, then stopped. Invitations that used to come with his name at the top began to come without it, and when he showed up anyway, the conversations stayed polite but shallow, like everyone had agreed to keep him at the edge of the room. He tried to laugh it off at first with the same confident tone he used on the plane, acting like people were being dramatic, but I could see the strain in the way his smile held too long and his eyes kept searching for validation that never arrived. He had always believed that if he controlled the story, he controlled reality, and now the story no longer belonged to him. A few days after our meeting, I saw what he could not hide anymore. A small local newsletter photo from a charity event where he stood one step back from the center, his face tight while other men held the microphones. It was not humiliation in the loud sense. It was worse for him. It was replacement. The world did not punish him. It simply moved forward without needing his approval. Elaine felt it too, and for the first time she stopped trying to smooth it over with comfort phrases. She called me one evening when she knew Richard was out, and her voice sounded tired in a way I had not heard before. She did not start with excuses. She started with a question she should have asked years ago. Mira, when did I stop protecting you? The words hit me harder than any insult Richard had thrown because they carried truth instead of performance. She admitted that she had chosen silence because she feared conflict, and because peace in that house had always been defined by Richard's mood. She said she told herself she was keeping the family together, but what she really did was teach him that he could cut me down without consequence. She did not ask me to fix it. She just said she was sorry, and that she finally understood how her quiet had become permission. I did not rush to comfort her. I let the silence do its work, because silence can be cruel, but it can also be honest, and this time it belonged to someone who needed to hear herself clearly. Evan unraveled differently. He avoided me for a while, which was not respect, it was shame. He had deleted the video he recorded on the plane, but deletion does not erase intent. and he knew I had seen what he did. One afternoon, he texted asking if we could talk, and for once, the message did not contain jokes or sarcasm. It was short and careful, like he was afraid of his own words. We met in a parking lot outside a grocery store because he did not want to face me in front of anyone he knew. He looked smaller than usual, his shoulders rounded and his eyes flicking away, the way guilty people do when they are trying not to drown in their own memory, he told me. He could not sleep because every time he closed his eyes, he heard the cabin change from annoyance to fear, and he kept thinking about the people behind us. The older couple praying, the mother holding her son's hand too tight, the man who said he had a heart condition and was trying to breathe through it. Evan admitted that his little joke could have helped push panic in the wrong direction and that the idea made him feel sick. He said, he always thought of me as someone who could take it, because I never fought back. And then he stopped and swallowed hard, because he finally understood that my silence was not weakness. It was discipline and restraint, and that he had been using it as entertainment. He did not say he was proud of me, and he did not try to attach himself to my recognition. He just said he was sorry, and that he did not know how to live with the image of what almost happened. I told him the truth, that real consequences are not about shame, they are about learning, and that if he wanted to change, he would start by never using another person's dignity as a prop again. That was the moment I felt the story turning from revenge to justice, because justice is the system restoring balance while leaving space for people to grow if they choose it. My own ending was quieter, but stronger. The day after the incident, I returned to base and the world looked ordinary again, in that familiar way. The gate checks the controlled speed, the clean lines of buildings that hold routines inside them. I reported, in the way I always did, without drama, without telling anyone how close it felt in the air and how loud it felt in the cabin. The liaison, who had called me earlier, met me in a small office that smelled like coffee and paper, and he did not praise me like a hero. He thanked me like a professional, and then asked me to walk through events step by step, because the military does not build safety on emotion, it builds it on process. He reminded me of the briefing I once sat through and the sentence that stayed with me when safety is compromised. Rank is irrelevant. Protocol is law, he said. I had followed that law, and that was why people were alive to go home. He handed me a folder with a plain cover, and inside were documents I had seen before in other forms, because this part of my career had always been quiet. I was not only trained, I was part of a small oversight track tied to aviation safety evaluation and special designation work, the kind that requires discretion and clear judgment, the kind that teaches you to speak only when your words reduce risk. The liaison did not name my assignment in detail, and neither will I, because the point is not secrecy for its own sake. The point is purpose and responsibility. He simply looked at me and said, "You were read in for a reason and you honored it." Then later, when I walked past a group of officers and enlisted near an admin building, one of them nodded and addressed me with a tone that carried recognition without spectacle. Ma'am, and in that single word there was the respect Richard had tried to steal with ridicule, but could never understand because he thought respect was a performance. I did not go home to announce any of it to my family. I did not send screenshots or demand apologies. I let the system do what it always does when someone shows competence and restraint at the right time. It records it quietly, and it moves forward with trust. In the weeks that followed, Richard kept losing rooms where he once held court. Elaine began to speak more and apologize less. Evan stopped joking and started listening, and I stayed steady because that is the only kind of revenge that lasts. I did not destroy them. I simply refused to protect their lies from the consequences of daylight. When I finally had a free evening, I returned to my quarters, hung my uniform carefully, the way I always had, and made tea. I sat with the mug warming my hands and listened to the soft hum of the air conditioner and the distant sounds of other people living their own disciplined lives. I thought about the plane and the silence after it, and the way my stepfather had looked when the world stopped believing him. I whispered the sentence that explained everything, and it felt like closing a door without slamming it. I wasn't hiding my rank. I was protecting my purpose. Honor is not something you prove to people who choose to despise you. It is something you carry when nobody is clapping, and when the moment comes, you use it to keep others safe. If you want more stories like this, quiet strength, real consequences follow, and tell me your state below.